Galadriel and her husband Celeborn have a famously complicated history in Tolkien's Legendarium. Let's try to piece together what we know up to when she becomes the Lady of Lothlorien that we all know. Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to Deep Geek. On this channel we cover great fantasy stories like The Lord of the Rings, A Song of Ice and Fire and The Witcher in nerdy detail. Welcome. Christopher Tolkien famously starts his chapter on the history of Galadriel and Celeborn in Unfinished Tales like this. There is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn, and it must be admitted that there are severe inconsistencies embedded in the traditions, or, to look at the matter from another point of view, that the role and importance of Galadriel only emerged slowly, and that her story underwent continual refashionings. For those who are new to this kind of deep dive into Tolkien's Legendarium, this is an important starting point. From outside, it can often look like Tolkien's Legendarium is complete and unchanging as it is so detailed and immersive. But in reality, for him, it was a living world that he changed frequently. He changed his mind on the nature of orcs several times. The number and nature of Balrogs shifted often. And here, as his son concluded, Galadriel's story underwent continual refashionings. That said, let's dive into what we can establish. As the parameters to this, there is no doubt that Galadriel was born in the Undying Lands during the Years of the Trees, and by the last millennium of the Third Age, she and Celeborn, her husband, were Lady and Lord of Lothlorien. It's what happens in between that is the mystery. Galadriel was born into a noble family of the Noldor, daughter of Finarfin and Eärwen of the Teleri. Elves often have several names, showing different aspects of their heritage and character, and Galadriel is no different. Her father named her Artanis, meaning noble woman. Her mother named her Nerwen, which means man-maiden, on account of her size and physical prowess. Certainly in her younger days she was extremely athletic. As Tolkien poetically puts it, she was then of Amazon disposition. Galadriel itself means maiden crowned with a garland of bright radiance, and was given to her by Celeborn, her husband-to-be. It again shows her athleticism, as that was how she wore her hair when doing exercises. It also obviously highlights her hair, and we could go into quite a digression there, taking in Feanor and Gimli among others, but for now let's just note that her hair was extraordinary, allegedly capturing the light of the two trees of Valinor themselves. And Feanor the mastersmith asking for one of her tresses was part of the unfriendship between the two of them, perhaps the two greatest elves. And although it might be tempting to view Feanor as all darkness and her all light, Tolkien didn't stoop to a dynamic quite so simplistic. Indeed, in her younger days, Tolkien repeatedly describes her as proud, never a positive description in his world. This is how he describes her in a relatively late essay. She had dreams of far lands and dominions that might be her own to order as she would without tutelage. Yet, deeper still, there dwelt in her the noble and generous spirit of the Vanya, and a reverence for the Valar that she could not forget. From her earliest years, she had a marvellous gift of insight into the minds of others, but judged them with mercy and understanding, and she withheld her goodwill from none, save only Feanor. In him she perceived a darkness that she hated and feared, though she did not perceive that the shadow of the same evil had fallen upon the minds of all the Noldor, and upon her own. So, yes, the Galadriel we find in her younger years is filled with mercy and understanding, but still she yearns for power, and a shadow of evil had fallen upon her mind. And in the wave of Feanor's rebellion and leading of his people to Middle-earth to take back the Silmarils, Galadriel also crosses the ocean, which is when our first uncertainty comes, because the Silmarillion asserts that Feanor's speech kindled in her a desire to rule over lands in Middle-earth, so she went along with the wider Noldorin host. However, in perhaps the last thing he ever wrote about Middle-earth, a partly illegible note written less than a month before his death, according to Christopher Tolkien, she appears to have already been planning to go to Middle-earth, and instead set off with Celeborn, a Teleri prince. In the Silmarillion and elsewhere, Celeborn was a Sindarin elf who she didn't meet until after she had arrived in Middle-earth. Do we go with the published account or Tolkien's later thoughts? It's the kind of question that Tolkien scholars have grappled with for years. One interesting implication of the Silmarillion account is that Galadriel wasn't called Galadriel until well into the First Age, because Celeborn gave her that name, and First Age Galadriel was therefore very much the athletic woman we read about, piling her hair atop her head for exercise. However, all accounts seem to have her fighting when Feanor attacked the Teleri at the turning of the ages, and all accounts have her and Celeborn based in Doriath in Middle-earth for most of the First Age. And perhaps, after all the pride, fire and fury of younger Galadriel, this is when she starts to mellow a bit. She certainly doesn't seem particularly involved in the endless wars and betrayals of the First Age. She and her brother Finrod settle in Doriath, and when he moves on to found his own kingdom, among other things, other than possibly visiting him at one point, she stays there. We're left to assume that this is because of Celeborn. The main reason she was in Middle-earth was to rule lands, and here she is postponing that. She does seem to learn, though, from Melian the Mire, who was there at the time. She will also have learned of the deaths of all three of her siblings who crossed to Middle-earth with her. And eventually, she and Celeborn do move on, east over the Blue Mountains into Eriador, in what we now think of as the map of Middle-earth. They are there through the last tumultuous years of the First Age. Were they looking for lands to rule, trying to avoid the conflict? We're not told. Still, at the end of the First Age, the Valar lifted their ban on the Noldorin elves returning to Valinor. One account has her refuse this, as she still wanted to rule in Middle-earth, and to be with Celeborn, who similarly wanted to stay. Another has the Valar specifically keep the ban on her as one of the leaders of the rebellious Noldor, and her biting back that she didn't want to go back to Valinor anyway. Either way, there is clearly still some pride and a desire to rule in Galadriel at this point. Whether the Valar would let her return isn't really the point. She wanted to stay in Middle-earth. And there's a wedding, too. Sometime around this point, we don't know exactly when, she and Celeborn marry. As a brief side point here, except in exceptional circumstances, elves find true love once and once only, and this bonds the two of them eternally. They have quite a rare connection, which, as we'll see, leads them to be apart for large periods of time, pursuing their own passions, but there is never a suggestion that they are anything other than completely devoted to each other. Their first and only child, a daughter named Celebrian, was born early in the Second Age, probably around the year 300. At which point we reach the confusion of their Second Age movements. They started in Lindon, that much is clear, before moving a little way to become the Lord and Lady of the Eldar in Eriador, based for a time near Lake Nenuil, which is only 100 miles or so north of what later became the Shire. At the time, they seem to have had quite a sizable number of elves following them. Gil-galad may have been High King, but these elves followed Galadriel and Celeborn. Then Galadriel seems to have gone to Eregion. Some accounts have her founding the New Realm, and others have Celebrimbor doing that. When Sauron, disguised as Anatar, wheedles his way in and starts crafting rings of power with Celebrimbor, he identifies Galadriel as his chief obstacle, and eventually she is forced out, passing through Khazad-dûm with her daughter to settle in the land later known as Lothlorien. And Celeborn? Well, let's not beat around the bush here. Celeborn hates dwarves. You see it in his reaction to Gimli in The Lord of the Rings, and he had clearly felt that way for thousands of years. He wouldn't go through Khazad-dûm with all those short-bearded people, and may even have steered clear of Eregion because of the good relations between Celebrimbor's elves and Durin's folk. He stayed west of the Misty Mountains, while his wife and daughter went east. To his credit, he did get involved in the War of the Elves and Sauron, when Sauron invaded Eriador, and along with Elrond discovered Imladris, which Elrond settled in and built in, and founded Rivendell. 300 or more years after their separation, when Sauron had been pushed back to Mordor once more, Galadriel and Celebrian headed west once more and found Celeborn in Rivendell. Again, timelines are vague here, but the small family later moved to the coast, to the area later known as Dol Amroth. If they played any part in the last alliance of elves and men that culminated with Isildur cutting the One Ring from Sauron's hand, we aren't told. Certainly neither Galadriel or Celeborn seem to have played a decisive role in that last battle. Through all this time, it's worth noting that in almost all of Tolkien's accounts, Galadriel seems to become increasingly concerned about Sauron. She sensed a growing, controlling evil in Middle-earth, as early as perhaps the year 500 of the Second Age. She saw the dwarves as important allies against Sauron's return. She opposed Anatar. She spent much of the early Third Age scouring the land, seeing how she could bolster opposition against the returning Shadow, and so on. As Christopher Tolkien summarises, quoting in Unfinished Tales, she deemed it her duty to remain in Middle-earth while Sauron was still unconquered. Celebrian, Galadriel and Celeborn's daughter, wedded Elrond in the year 109 of the Third Age, and they spent some of that age there with her. But when Durin's Bane appeared in the year 1980 of the Third Age, the orcs started pushing outwards, leading to mass migrations of dwarves and elves alike. This coincided with the loss of Amroth, the last king of Lothlorien, and Galadriel and Celeborn accepted the invitation to rule that land, taking in elf refugees as they did so. They refused the title of king and queen. At which point, the Galadriel we know appears where we know her, in Lothlorien. For the avoidance of doubt, yes, Tolkien uber-nerds, I have simplified this history quite a lot. Personally, I put the greatest weight on what J.R.R. Tolkien wrote in the stories that we know, then what Christopher Tolkien put into the Silmarillion, and later referenced as alternative accounts in Unfinished Tales, but there are a plethora of other possibilities and emphases that Tolkien considered over the years. So, where does all that leave us? Two things, really. First, anyone suggesting that it is clear what Tolkien intended for Galadriel and Celeborn in the Second and early Third Age is missing the detail here. There are lots of possibilities that Tolkien considered, not just in terms of where she and Celeborn were, but also when and how she shifted from the athletic, proud man-maiden we read of earlier to the wise, calm lady of Lothlorien. It was surely a slow shift rather than an abrupt character change. But second, and probably more importantly, none of the different accounts actually change the overarching character arcs that we have here. Celeborn seems quite the solid, sensible type that perhaps the proud, hot-tempered younger Galadriel needed. Yes, he had a particular aversion to dwarves, probably for family history reasons that we don't need to go into here, but we should acknowledge that whatever we might think of him, Galadriel called him the Wise. Perhaps she benefited from it more than anyone else. And Galadriel's arc is clear in every account. Whether she was excluded by the Valar or decided to stay in Middle-earth of her own volition at the end of the First Age, whether she established Eriador or simply moved there, whether she personally opposed Sauron Anatar there or just worked from afar, the character arc is clear. When she first moved to Middle-earth, it was because she wanted to rule a land and people of her own without instruction from anyone else. That may sound like simple high aspirations, but to Tolkien it was almost certainly a hint that she was power-hungry. She was definitely proud. Tolkien tells us that a shadow of evil had fallen on her mind. But over time, this shifts. She gets wise counsel from Melian and falls in love with someone else she considers wise. She leads people, but never claims to be queen. When she finally gets asked to rule, she explicitly refuses the title, and she seems to slowly grow into a new calling. To return to that earlier quote, she deemed it her duty to remain in Middle-earth while Sauron was still unconquered. She had gone to Middle-earth, apparently with dreams of power and ruling for their own sake, but slowly she began to understand what wise ruling truly meant. Serving, protecting, helping. And in that context, her final test, when Frodo offers her the One Ring and all the power that goes with it, makes perfect sense. He is offering her complete power, the thing she once desired more than anything. But she has grown and changed and matured. So she says this: I do not deny that my heart has greatly desired to ask what you offer. For many years I had pondered what I might do should the great ring come into my hands, and behold, it was brought within my grasp, and now at last it comes. You will give me the ring freely. In place of the Dark Lord you will set up a queen, and I shall not be dark but beautiful and terrible as the morning and the night, fair as the sea and the sun and the snow upon the mountain, dreadful as the storm and the lightning, stronger than the foundations of the earth. All shall love me and despair. She lifted up her hand, and from the ring that she wore there issued a great light that illumined her alone and left all else dark. She stood before Frodo, seeming now tall beyond measurement, and beautiful beyond enduring, terrible and worshipful. Then she let her hand fall, and the light faded, and suddenly she laughed again. And lo, she was shrunken, a slender elf woman, clad in simple white, whose gentle voice was soft and sad. "I pass the test," she said. "I will diminish and go into the west and remain Galadriel." This speech only makes sense if she had once desired lands and power of her own, if she had not always opposed Sauron, if those things and that wisdom had only emerged slowly over time, and now she had to face a final test to see if she had truly moved beyond her proud beginnings. And she passes the test. Galadriel and Celeborn's history is complex. Tolkien changed his mind several times, and her importance only emerged as he wrote his magnum opus and after. But her overall character arc, and Celeborn's role as not just a supporting actor, but as a central part in her becoming the Galadriel we know, is clear from the start. Galadriel was not always the wise lady of Lothlorien. It took her thousands of years to get there, and perhaps we should take hope from that whenever we ourselves fall short. Who we were does not determine who we can be. If you'd like to see more videos like this, diving deep into Tolkien's Legendarium, there's a link appearing now on the left of your screen. Or to support this channel, thank you. There's a link appearing now on the right of your screen. Thanks for watching. That's all for this time. I'll see you again soon.